The name of the book is called The Dragon in the Room, China and the Future of Latin American Industrialization. And we go at length in at least the first half of the book to show how China has brought great benefits to Latin America. We categorize the benefits into three. One, China is a new export market for Latin American goods. With the exception of Chile and a couple countries in the Southern Cone, the majority of Latin American goods for a long time have either gone the majority of them to the United States or some to the United States and Europe. And now you have this whole new growth pole in China and to a certain extent India where Latin Americans can sell their goods. We see that as a good thing. A diversified portfolio is a good thing. The majority of that export market is for Latin American commodities. And I'll show there's only a handful of them that drive the majority of that. Not only does it positively impact Latin America that Latin Americans are selling these commodities to the Chinese, there's also an indirect effect. Because the Chinese and the Indians are new folks on the world market that are demanding these commodities, they're making them more scarce. And so the price of these commodities, because of Chinese demand and a number of other factors, including speculation, is causing increases in the price for many key Latin American commodities. So there's an indirect effect. So not only is say, Brazil selling more iron and more soybeans to the Chinese, that's one great benefit. Another benefit is that because China is creating more scarcity for iron, the price of iron is higher and they're getting a better price for iron when they sell it to the Australians. They're getting a better price for iron when they sell it to the Europeans. Another benefit is in the form of cheaper import prices and manufacturers. Right? Trade is a two-way street, and the Latin Americans sell, for the most part, a lot of commodities to the Chinese, and the Chinese are selling low-skilled manufacturing products into the Latin American markets. Because those are relatively cheaper, that brings what is called a welfare benefit. If I spend $10 a month or $10 a week on coffee, and all of a sudden coffee is only going to cost me $8 a week, then I have a $2 a week welfare benefit or a $2 a week boost in my income. So Latin Americans are seeing boosts in their incomes for those reasons. When we were writing this book, things have really changed in the past year, but when we were writing this book, a lot of the stories stopped there. There was a real euphoria about China and Latin America, and a lot of the political economy hadn't started to really shake out. And we wanted to raise some of the potential costs that can happen in the short, medium, and long term. So alongside those benefits, we focus on costs in terms of job creation, in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of exchange rates and what's called the resource curse. And what we say the real dragon in the room is that perhaps the China entry into the world economy might be playing a role in the deindustrialization of Latin America. That the Latin American manufacturing firms are having a hard time competing with Chinese in Latin American markets and in global markets in the United States and Europe and elsewhere in Asia. We, however, still take an optimistic note. We think that China is a great opportunity for Latin America. But the challenge is really at the Latin American doorstep, that there are some things that they need to do to be able to maximize those benefits and minimize those costs. And that's the real challenge that we say that the Latin Americans need to grasp onto in order to get the maximum benefits they can get from the China relationship. If not, some of the consequences could be grave, and we spell some of that out too. So that's the whole thing. Let me walk through some of this. This just shows Latin American exports to China from 1985 to 2009. There are $41.3 billion in 2009. The 2010 data looks like it's over $50 billion, and if you add the imports, it's the first year that exports and imports are over $100 billion to China from Latin America. It's now closer to 10% of all Latin American exports, and it's one key thing is that it's 25 to 30% of all China's imports of commodities. I highlight that because I think that the Latin Americans have a real strategic role to play for the Chinese, that the Latin Americans can be a little bit better on leveraging that. China has become the #1 trading partner for a number of countries in terms of exports and imports. It's now the #1 trading partner for Brazil, whereas it was a very distant number 12 in the year 2000. It's #1 for Chile. It was #5. It's #2 for Peru, and I think they might have, I've seen some estimates that it might be #1 for 2010, although Carol is the expert on that one. One thing that's important to note, though, however, is that 5 countries and just about 8 sectors dominate almost all of the Latin American trade to China. And when it comes right down to it, it's really soybeans, copper, iron ore, and crude oil, right? Those 4 are well over 82–83% of all Latin American exports to China. And those 4 sectors are concentrated in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, a little bit of Peru, Colombia. The Mexicans are selling some more copper. Now the copper prices are up and some scrap metal and so forth, but that's not the bulk of it. The Chinese have been engaged in foreign investment in Latin America. Not a heck of a lot relative to other countries in other periods, but it's rising at an increasing rate. The red lines here are the total stocks of Chinese foreign investment in the world, and the blue are the annual flows that were $56 billion in 2009. Might be somewhere around $75 billion for 2010. This is global. There's all sorts of problems with the way that they calculate these statistics, so people like Enrique and I have to piece together firm by firm databases on what's really going on. You can't read this slide, but this just shows that this is a list from 2005 until 3/4 of the way through 2010 of some of the biggest Chinese projects in Latin America. And let me just focus on this part right here. If you look at what sectors it's going into those 4 sectors: soybeans, copper, iron ore, oil, all right? And the majority of it is in South America, and it's resource seeking. Chinese firms are going there to try to get access to the same resources that they are importing. Some of it, however, is market seeking. Chinese firms are going to Latin America to try to sell to Latin Americans. Latin American growth has been faster than developed country growth since about 2004, 2005. And a small but growing percent of it is what's called efficiency seeking. They go to Latin America so they can sell to a rich neighbor. So there's some computer, automobile, and textiles firms that are Chinese that will be soon or are selling into the United States. And there's auto companies that are in Uruguay that are trying to sell into the larger Mercosur markets. These are the sort of microeconomic reasons why there's Chinese foreign investment in Latin America. On a macro level, China's made a decision they need to diversify away from these treasury bills that they hold too many of in the United States. And they also have a general push as part of their larger industrial policy to try to pick some national champions of their own companies that they want to be. They want to be household names, like GE is a household name almost all around the world, or Coca-Cola. They hope that Sinopec is a household name the way Exxon is over the next 10 years, and Huawei, which has become a household name to a certain extent here in the United States. One other key thing is a paper that I'm working on now, I don't have a slide for yet, is Chinese loans to Latin America. Chinese have loaned about $50 billion to the Latin Americans just in the past 2 or 3 years. And some of it is really interesting because they're loaning to countries like Ecuador and Argentina that can't at the moment borrow money in international capital markets because of their crises and certain defaults. But the Chinese aren't lending this money willy-nilly. Often with countries with higher risk, the Chinese lend money but don't want to be paid in a Latin American currency. They want to be paid in commodities. They've reinvigorated the commodity-backed loan, where most of them are around oil, although there's one in negotiation with Bolivia right now that might be around steel. So those are the benefits, right? And these are real benefits. You've got a new export market that isn't the United States or Europe or Japan, which are countries that are pretty much still in the recovery mode right now, right? So you've got a new growth pole. You've got new foreign investment into the countries. You have these new imports that I didn't talk too much about. I cut that slide out to get the 20 minutes in. And then you have a new source of financing, and for some countries it's some of the only source of financing that you can get, because you can't get money from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Development Bank, or from J.P. Morgan and global capital markets, because you've defaulted on your loans and you're shunned by bond markets. Well, what about some of the costs and concerns? Okay, especially in countries like Chile right now, the concept of China is really, really euphoric. And we organize some of our concerns about the medium and longer run future into 4 categories. Well, one, will Chinese demand and prices continue out into the future? Right? So this whole set of positiveness is built on the fact of a Chinese growth miracle that's been going on for 30 years. Can it still go on for another 30 years? 2, what about the competitiveness of manufacturing and exchange rates and some of the issues around resource curses in the region? 3, what are the impacts on employment and on the environment? Much of this investment and much of the growth is going into employment, into low employment sectors and highly environmentally sensitive sectors. And 3rd, what's the impact on politics? This is something I'm working on more now, is that the Chinese entry into the Latin American dynamic is really changing and disrupting some of the sort of political coalitions and political thinking in the region. I don't know if I'll get through all 4 of these. Chinese demand. First of all, I should say I'm a recovering economist. We blew up the world in 2008, so any prediction that we make, you take with a grain of salt, okay? So I did not, anything could happen with China. We know over the past 30 years, China's been this incredible growth miracle. But they've done it through state-led industrialization and lots of investment, and there's lots of signs of overheating. So one, by its own model, it might overheat. We don't know. Also, in their new 5-year plan, they say they're actually going to change their model. They're going to move away from export-oriented growth, and where they're going to have demand-led growth. And what will that do for the composition of what they want from other countries? And will they succeed at that? Or if they do, will they succeed at 3% growth rather than the 10% growth that they've had? So we don't know, okay? Given that we don't know, what does a guy like me to do? Well, I did some general calculations. For the 4 key commodities, I compared what Japan, the United States, South Korea, similar other kinds of countries, what kinds of per capita consumption did they have at different levels of income over time, and how close is China to those? And I got this idea from the Sino-Latin guys. They did this for one of these. So if you look at crude oil, China, even though we hear about them in the Financial Times every day about how much crude oil they're purchasing, their per capita consumption of crude oil is nowhere near the South Korean, Japan, or here we go, United States, right? They have a long way to go. So if they grow and have the same level of income that we do, maybe it'll be in 10 or 15 years, the way Goldman Sachs says it. Maybe things won't be that smooth and it'll happen 100 years. But if and when China becomes a developed country, there's a long way to go here. I spell out some baby calculations in my paper that I'm presenting tomorrow that says it's somewhere between 40 to 150 years worth of demand for oil. So if you're Colombia, if you're Argentina, maybe if you're Mexico, if you're Brazil, there's a market for this stuff into the future. I did the same calculations for iron ore, same calculations for copper, and the same calculations for soy. And soy is the only one that doesn't look like the other 3. So the other 3 says there's demand for from China for this stuff for a long time. Soybeans, if you compare it to some of its other Asian neighbors, it's already there, but at a lower level of development. But look at the United States. What do we do with our soybeans here? You guys all eat tofu for lunch? No. Who eats tofu for lunch every day? The animals. All right, the United States has a soy feed-based economy. And according to, I was a visiting professor in China last year, and I asked folks, and China is considering moving into a soy-based feed they want to be self-sufficient in beef. And the amount of beef that they're eating per capita is rising as they get richer. And so I'm not saying they're going to go this way, but if they go this way, there's a longer way to go. If they don't, then they could be close to saturation. Competitiveness. This is a picture, this red line here is a picture of Chinese manufacturing exports as a percent of total world manufacturing exports from 1980 to the most recent year that I had data for, 2009. So in 1980, China is not in the top 100 countries of the world in global manufacturing market share. It's not on the radar screen. And in 2009, without even adding in Hong Kong and Macau, it is the most quote-unquote competitive manufacturing economy in the world. All right. If you look, these others, and I tried to match it, I did this during the World Cup, I tried to match it with the flag. So Argentina's market share has been declining. Brazil's has been declining. Mexico, which has one of the most similar export profiles to China, was climbing until 2000 and has been struggling to compete since China enters the WTO in 2000. We did a whole bunch of statistical analyses in our book. I've updated them for these talks. And basically, we've looked at over 144 sectors in all the countries in the world, and specifically looking at Latin America. And we use a methodology devised by the Asian Development Bank that says if there's a statistical correlation whereby a Chinese Latin American sector, say textiles, is losing market share in the world economy, and the Chinese textiles sector is gaining market share, that's called a direct threat. Where the Latin American textile sector is gaining market share in the world economy, but the Chinese textile sector, for instance, is gaining market share at a faster pace, that's considered a partial threat. And we do these calculations for the countries with the most similar export profiles to China and Chile, because everyone says you should have Chile. The bottom line, because I'm running out of time, is that 92% of all manufacturing exports in Latin America in 2009 were under threat from China, representing 40%, 39.7% of all Latin American exports. And this is much more grave than the estimates that I had in the book, which only went up to 2007. And we're starting to see some of the effects of this. Here you have manufactured exports as a percent of GDP in Brazil. For the first year in 2009, it's been less than commodities. And this gray shaded here are exports to China. I'm gonna let the Mexican talk about Mexico since I don't have much time. But if you look at the Mexican market in electronics, a sector that Enrique's done a lot of, and so have I, you find the same story. One of the things that some people in Mexico and Central America say is, well, because China's becoming an innovation powerhouse now, and their wages are going up, we might be able to capture all that stuff because our wages are going down. These are Flextronics workers in China, and Flextronics workers on May the 1st of 2007 in Mexico, and they are protesting the subcontracting or the temporary work and lower wages that firms are doing to try to compete with the Chinese. And those firms are successful. This is a new table by J.P. Morgan. Shows the Mexican wages have gone down by 15% and the Chinese wages going up. So yeah, maybe 2011, 2012, the two will meet. Perhaps for the question and answer, that's one of my worst fears. That would be one of the worst lessons to take from all this stuff. Jobs in the environment, you have to come, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to focus all of tomorrow's talk on jobs in the environment. I got these great graphs about the Brazilian Amazon, but I'm not going to let you see. I think it'll be too much to talk about the politics and the winners and losers, I think. So let me spend a little bit of time on reiterating my key points and then saying what the lessons for policy are. Tomorrow I'll talk more about lessons for theory and academic thinking and so forth. So China's a great benefit for the region. We've got new markets, new sources of funding, but it's also got costs. They're outcompeting, the Chinese are outcompeting the Latin Americans in world markets. That's all I showed you. But we've also done analysis that shows it's happening in Brazil, in Mexico, that the Brazilian auto parts firms are having trouble competing with their counterparts. Machinery having trouble competing with their counterparts in their own markets. All right, and as you see more and more of this investment into the commodities sector, you can get a bump up in the exchange rate. We've seen average exchange rates have gone up about 14% in Latin America, 40% in Brazil, despite a year and a half of capital controls, which makes those exports even less competitive in world markets. And that's a real problem for the longer run future, because to grow, you can't just grow on a single commodity. Latin America spent 100 years trying to move away from that. Right? You have to have a diversified export and production base, which includes commodities, which includes exports of manufacturers, which includes domestic demand from manufacturers, which includes a vibrant agricultural sector, and domestic services and modern services and so forth. And if you steer towards one sector, you're going to be in trouble. You can go to Nigeria to find out what that's like. In addition to that, there's a jobs problem. I've got a graph I didn't show you that shows that all the sectors that there's export growth in, there's actually jobs decline in, because as those things become more mechanized, they need less and less workers for each new unit of output. So whereas soybean production and exports have tripled in the past couple of years from Brazil, employment in the sector has gone down. At the same time, when employment's going down in the cities because the firms can't compete with the Chinese firms in Sao Paulo and so forth. And that causes some political issues. So those are some of the longer term concerns, and there's some real environmental concerns about drilling holes in the ground for iron, for copper and soybeans, etc. What do we can do about policy? Well, I think the Latin Americans, that even though China poses some threats, that the problem is not China. I am not a China basher by any stretch of the imagination, and it irks me sometimes when our government tries to blame the financial crisis on their accumulation of reserves and blame all of our problems on their exchange rate. Sure, they have too many reserves. Sure, their exchange rate is undervalued, but that is not the root of the problem, and especially in the Latin American case. I think that if you think about the late 1970s, early 1980s, both Latin Americans and the Chinese said, we want to get rid of this inward-looking economic policy and we want to embrace the world. And I'll argue that the Chinese have figured out how to become globalizers much better than the Latin Americans have. And that the Latin Americans can really learn about that. One core thing is that the Chinese have figured out what endogenous productive capacity, I guess that's a word for tomorrow, but they figured out what industrialization. They realize that industry is important, that services are important, that innovation is important. And that's what's fueling all of their demand. One innovation that the Latin Americans have, especially the Chileans, are something called stabilization funds. Chile had the largest stimulus package in Latin America after the crisis, because they have this fund that when the copper price hits a certain level, some of that money goes into government coffers. That's allowed them to spend money on innovative conditional cash transfers and other kinds of educational programs. It's the only country in the region that's going to meet the Millennium Development Goals, partly because they use their natural resource for social benefit. And with all due respect to my friend from Mexico, I know he agrees with me on this one, the Mexicans are the example of the country that has the reverse of a stabilization fund. Revenues from the state-owned oil company supply 40% or 38% of the government budget every year with no long-term plan for the future. So more countries could have stabilization funds and use the benefits of all this 100 years of demand that I'll predict for industrialization, for social programs, and for rainy days. I also made that one point about, if you look at 57% of all Chinese iron comes from Brazil. And Brazil has been innovative about this. Brazil said, we know that. We know that there's not too many other places, especially stable democracies, that the Chinese can get their iron from. So in 2009, the Brazilians were doing bids for iron, and they said, we're only going to grant a contract to you if you also build an employment-generating steel plant. And that's how they leverage the fact that they have something strategic for the Chinese. Argentina, Chile aren't doing some of those things. You can learn from China about innovation, industrialization, and science policy. Brazil's the only country in the region that has R&D expenditures over 1% of GDP. China's are about 1.5%. Everyone else is well below 0.5% of GDP. And there are lots of Latin Americans now that their incomes are rising a little bit, but they're somewhat being ignored. The region still is thinking about export-led growth path. And if you are going to use commodities and primary commodities and natural resources as part of your growth strategy, you've got to think about the environment. You can't grow now, wait about deal with the environment later, because it's not like, oh, you know, when the copper's gone, the copper is gone, right? And if you don't have a stabilization fund like Norway had one for their oil, then you don't have much left at all. And so in addition to your stabilization fund, you have to get more serious at a lower level of economic development than about the environment. And finally, the Latin Americans, I didn't talk about this that much. You got to focus more on coalitions and global economic governance. Some smaller, in say the WTO, many Latin American countries stand in these big coalitions with the Chinese, with the Brazilians, with the South Africans and the Indians, and they get better deals, I would argue, which give you more space to do some of this kind of stuff. Whereas when it's one country and the United States, say Panama and the United States, negotiating over access to a $13 trillion economy, it's a negotiation that the Panamanians can't refuse, and they actually sign on to things that they're in coalitions about at the WTO that they say that they wouldn't agree to over their dead body. And it's harder with some of the European and U.S. trade deals to do some of this kind of stuff. That's my second to the last point. I am glad to be here, but I'll be here again in June.